Thank you everyone for joining this webinar on external monitoring. This webinar is specifically focused around the fraud industry. It highlights real examples of fraud identified by DomainGuard, and it is a joint collaboration between Access Point and DomainGuard. My name is Erkan Gingiev. I am founder of DomainGuard, founded the company in 2021 with the goal of combating the exact type of fraud that we're going to showcase today. With me, I'm joined by Michael Sveiben, co-founder of DomainGuard.
Thanks, Erkan. Yeah, Michael Sveiben, co-founder of DomainGuard. I have over 15 years of cybersecurity experience. The majority of my career has been in offensive security, performing penetration testing, red team operations, building red team programs for various organizations and companies. I had the privilege of working with some really smart individuals, Erkan being one of them, throughout my career. And, I also am privileged to, be part of the DomainGuard journey, helping customers and leverage my offensive security experience to help protect their existing networks, people, process, and technology.
So to give you a quick overview of what we're going to discuss today, this will start with talking about the timeless problem of impersonation. And what we mean by that is impersonation is a common fraud tactic that's, essentially been around since the existence of time, and it is used today. We'll talk about the history of fraud and, more importantly, the history of key technological advancements such as telephones, mobile phones, the internet, social media, and how that's a double-edged sword of technology, allowing for abuse, the benefits of that technology coming with abuse cases. We'll get into the fraud problem and what we've relabeled here as the fraud industry, because it is that. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. We talked about statistics in webinar 1. We talked about anecdotes. And the cool part about this webinar is you'll actually get to see real fraud identified by the team. So it's not only, what ifs and hypotheticals, it's what we've actually seen. And lastly, we'll do a Q&A to showcase how you could be better protected as an individual or as an organization if you work in corporate cybersecurity. So getting into this problem of impersonation, it really is as ancient as human civilization itself. So very plainly, impersonation is a form of fraud whereby any individual or entity impersonates another individual or entity. I'm claiming to be somebody that I'm not. A modern example of this is, if I were to dress up as a healthcare worker and walk through a hospital, or if I were to wear, Amazon or UPS gear and use that to get physical access to a building I may not otherwise, I'm impersonating these entities or individuals with the goal of achieving some sort of deceit or fraud. And while that is a timeless problem, it dates back to, we have stories in Greek mythology, religion, of gods impersonating humans as one example. We have familial wax seals, which were used to provide integrity on things like letters historically. We also have signets, and to give you a very modern example for anybody that's seen Dune 2, there's a very popular part of the movie where Paul Atreides gives this very amazing speech and then references his ducal signet, which is ultimately a ring that has his familial seal on there. And the purpose of the seal, once again, is to provide authenticity and integrity. And what people want to do is they want to impersonate, they want to steal these wax seals, these signets. And all of that logic can be applied to modern day. So if I want to impersonate somebody through email, sure, you can have security controls around email, and you can provide authenticity and integrity through email, but it's just as easy to impersonate a domain name and send emails from that impersonation domain and provide the same security. It's the duty of the person on the receiving end to trust that seal. And that's why this problem really is timeless. And we feel as new technology emerges, it continues to be exacerbated by that technology. So getting into the double-edged sword of technology, highlighting some key technological advancements. We had the telephone era of the 1950s. What this enables us to do is groundbreaking, right? We can speak with individuals over the phone. Otherwise, we had to be physically connected, or we had to, send letters by mail. But now we can speak with people real time. This is a huge advancement. But what it also allows is for somebody to impersonate or conduct fraud using that same mechanism. And I know this is going to come off as sounding very negative around these technological advancements. I do want to be clear that, yes, all of these technologies have revolutionized the world, but it's worth noting that it is a double-edged sword. And as we advance that technology, the unfortunate edge of that blade as it will be abused by attackers. Then comes the internet age. This is when email phishing becomes really prevalent. And what it has done, once again, if historically in the past you need to have social reach to conduct fraud, now you have anonymity behind a computer screen, behind a keyboard. You can create fake email domains. You can create fake websites, marketplaces, and you could send it to anybody that has internet access. So if pre-1900s, the best you could do is impersonate a wax seal, well, you're not going to conduct that much fraud. Or if the best you can do is try to recreate or steal a signet on a ring, once again, how much fraud you can actually conduct is going to be highly limited. But with the advent of telephones, with the advent of the internet, with the advent of mobile phones, it becomes much easier to communicate, and therefore it becomes much easier to impersonate and conduct fraud. So getting into social media, roughly 2008, 2010, scammers are now able to create fake identities. What made social media so popular and what made it so revolutionizing is you're able to connect emotionally. People are using these platforms and they're highly successful, highly addictive, because they're built around our social nature as a human. And what attackers are able to do is exploit our human psychology to ultimately create fake profiles, using fake photos, fake identities. And if you see here bolded on the slides, each of these technologies continues to be abused since its creation. And that's a very important part of this. Go ahead, Michael.
So with social media, we've been seeing a lot of like impersonations over social media, right? So, some customers, but also some family members too, right? Like, they may not have any social media, right? But these threat actors are creating, an appearance, right, on various different like TikTok and, X or Facebook, and they're just creating profiles that people don't even, know is there, right? So, but it is interesting that, we're seeing it become more and more prevalent, right? And it's not just one threat actor, it's multiple threat actors impersonating you, right? And impersonating family members. So it's really easy to be, deceived, right? From, if someone reaches out to me, I think I'm communicating with a family member or, a coworker. So you really have to be very careful with the way these technologies have kind of evolved. But social media is definitely something that we're seeing a big, big problem in recently.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this timeline is up until roughly 2014, the best you can do as an attacker is either steal somebody's photo or pay for a stock photo. Mm-hmm. Where it gets more dangerous is with this new wave of AI advancements, which we're going to refer to as generative AI, and I will leave it at that. I am no AI expert. I understand this stuff at a high level. But ultimately, as of 2014, that's when GANs, or generative adversarial networks, give us the capability to produce deep fakes. And what that is photos or videos of individuals that are either, one, not real. So now we can generate photos of somebody that doesn't even exist, or two, we can clone somebody that already does exist and put their face, in a different emotion, different distortion. We can alter their face and their video and their actions. So before this era, it's very easy to identify a fake photo, because if you know the person, you know their account, you can see that, well, clearly they've been impersonated. Now, when somebody's reaching out to you, you don't even know if there's a real human that looks like the photo. And we'll cover this a lot more on webinar 6, going specifically over the generative AI implications of all of this fraud.
Yeah, we've seen some really interesting impersonations, right? Like how realistic it really is. So I
Yeah.
think, from a defensive perspective, and this is something that, I guess needs to continue to grow, is like how can you leverage technology, right, to actually detect these deep fakes, right? But it seems like it's a challenge and something that we're trying to raise awareness on, right, for both personal as well as corporate people, to acknowledge it, right? Hey, that this threat is growing and it's getting better.
I think that's the key, Michael. There needs to be a technological layer in place to identify that the photo is not real or was generated using one of these tools, these generative AI methodologies, because ultimately what we see to our human eye cannot pick that up. And attackers have been storing malicious things in photos for years because they know that what we see to our human eye is not what's made up in the file data of the photo. So getting into this fraud industry and why we ultimately decided to call it an industry and not a problem is, these numbers are staggering. We have 8 billion in 22, greater than 10 billion in 23, and more than 12.5 billion in 24. And based on the Q1 data, we're already expected to surpass these numbers.
Erkin, this is just reported losses, right?
That's
What
right.
about, so it's not accounting for things that get unreported, right? And people just ignore the fraud, right?
Yeah. And that's a very alarming distinction to make because so much of fraud goes unnoticed or unreported because if you have hundreds or thousands of credit card transactions over the course of the year, bank account looks great, you may miss the $20, $30 transaction. If it's a larger transaction, you have to go through the process of reporting, working with the credit card company, anyone else. There's a process involved to report this fraud. And that's what, we can assume these numbers are much higher.
And it's not even accounting for, let's say there's this thing called like sextortion, right? Where they send an email saying that they have access to you and they have remote access to your system. People, I guess are not even reporting on, some of those threats because,
Yeah.
they may seem, you know, embarrassed by it, right? And then they're being, they're being challenged, or not challenged, but they're being, directed to send currency in cryptocurrency, right? So that's
Mm-hmm.
another big component of this dollar amount that's unreported, is that other, digital currency that's, turns it or translates into real currency. But
Yeah.
that, I've heard a lot of stories from people, and one of a friend of mine, said that, his family member was interesting, was defrauded of, I don't know, it was like $20,000 or so, and he went to like a Bitcoin ATM, right, to actually transfer the funds in. But the individual was much older, right? They didn't know that this fraud, can, you know, can exist, right, at that level and that scale. And they think they're doing business with a legitimate person, but they're using all this technology, to go after, younger folks, but older folks that are just not aware of the threat.
Yeah. And I didn't even think about the shame or guilt component because, obviously certain type of fraud where, sextortion or anything else may be involved, there probably is an element of shame or guilt associated with it. They just want to make the problem go away. They're not necessarily going to report it. And getting into these top fraud reports by category, you can see that timeless problem of impersonation we talked about and how we introed is the number one most reported type of scam. And that shows how impersonation really is a timeless problem. And no matter what or what technology we use, no matter what technological advancements we have, people are going to always use that as a fraud tactic, showcasing some of these other ones that are really popular recently. And we estimate that the percentages will go up is business and job related opportunities. Based on where the market is now from an employment standpoint, these attackers are, essentially taking advantage of the fact that there's more people that are unemployed, that may be more desperate for opportunities. And Michael, I know you had a very specific use case to talk about with a customer of ours.
Yeah. So, and before I get into that, but just to, you know, expand upon what you were mentioning about, threat actors and bad actors, targeting people that are unemployed. And a lot of these threat actors, they start their reconnaissance by going to LinkedIn, right? So you have that open to work tag, right, on LinkedIn. You're posting that, hey, you just lost your job, right? You're looking for these types of roles, right? They kind of look at your background, and essentially what they do is, in one of our customers in particular, they essentially have all these job recs, right, that are out there for ZipRecruiter and some of Indeed, and then some other recruiting sites, and essentially they have been getting notified that someone has been impersonating their domain, and then targeting these unsuspecting victims, right, in this job fraud, right? So basically, what they do, they may contact someone through email, right, or through LinkedIn directly, impersonating an organization, and then they quickly move to WhatsApp or some other phone service, right, or through text messaging, and they kind of are coercing these individuals and impersonating, hey, I'm from HR, I'm from this organization. And then they move on to Zoom as well. So they're impersonating the brand even on Zoom, right? And you may not have visibility into all of this, what's going on from that perspective, because they're not targeting specifically, your employees or your organization. They're going outside your organization. But yeah, so it's the level of fraud that we see from the job recruiting, that entire process, and how convincing these individuals are, right? These bad actors, is kind of alarming, right? They're even saying, hey, here goes all this documentation. They have, these job offer letters, right, that are very significant, and then they kind of try to move it on to the next step by saying, hey, you know, you can go ahead and make purchases, right? We'll reimburse you, or some way of trying to get them to pay money back or something along
Yeah.
those lines, right? Or link in, okay, what's your bank account information, right? So that we can kind of do ACH transfer. But it is very alarming with the job recruiting fraud that's going on.
Yeah. And, that's actually a really good segue into something I was going to talk about on the next slide, but I'm going to bring it up here is when we show these fraud numbers, these fraud statistics, and I will be very clear, the elderly population in the US is heavily targeted for fraud. And there are numbers to back that up. And that pisses people off. They're abusing a very specific population. When you look at these numbers, they're staggering and people get really angry, rightfully so. But where this segues is there actually was a news article released about an individual who was in Asia applying for a job, goes through a rigorous interview process, gets the job, ends up in another location in Asia, and all of a sudden he is forced into a scam labor camp to conduct exactly these types of scams. So we get really angry when we see, I can't believe these scammers are conducting fraud. I wish terrible things could happen to these people. But there's a very unfortunate side of this, that the people conducting this fraud are in a labor camp forced to do this for 16 hours a day.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, Erkan.
And then going on to the types of fraud reported by contact method. So previous slide was the category of fraud. This is what method are the fraudsters using to contact individuals. And we can see, as we alluded to in webinar number 1, it's going way beyond just email-based phishing, and certainly don't want to say it's outdated. It'll always go away, but it's much more sophisticated. What attackers are still doing, though, is they're still registering lookalike domains. So in the example that Michael listed, where they were using Zoom or other social media platforms, they still need a lookalike domain to be the primary for, creating the Zoom accounts or creating other accounts, and they're still using that method. So let's get into it. Let's look at some real fraud. And anytime we talk about this, one of the common points of feedback we get is, okay, well, I can definitely see why a consumer or somebody on social media may be defrauded or scammed. Yeah, I get those text messages all the time, but like surely these large corporations and brands have this problem under control. I mean, the internet's been around for 30 plus years now. Technology improves year after year. We're so advanced. How unsafe can it be? Well, and to give you an answer, very unsafe. Big brands, they become big targets. Looking at something like this, and as you can see, there's multiple tabs here. This is a brand that you may be familiar with, and I'm being facetious here. Obviously, we all know who Amazon is, but these are at least 4 lookalike domains pretending to be Amazon that were identified by Domain Guard with the goal of defrauding customers and consumers. So our point with this is, if this is a problem that Amazon faces, which arguably has more resources than any other organization, clearly we haven't solved this problem yet. Getting into another very common example, here we have a designer jewelry brand, David Yurman, and this website here is an impersonation site. So what the attackers have done is they've made a direct clone of the legitimate David Yurman website, and they know that people want discounts. So they've actually discounted the jewelry on this website to trick people into providing personal details, credit card details, and more information that could be used for their scams. And I do want to make a very important note here too, that David Yurman, the brand, or Amazon, the brand, all of this happens without their knowledge and it's outside of their control. So whether or not an attacker registers a lookalike domain, uses that to conduct fraud, that's outside the control of the brand. However, it does still leave a bad taste in the customer's end. If I get defrauded or if the customer gets defrauded through one of these websites, there's going to be a negative brand association there. And what these companies can do is what we'll talk about in further webinar episodes around how you can monitor for these types of threats. And lastly, Amazon's not your thing. You like to shop local, or designer jewelry is not your thing. Well, what about VPN software? If you think about the typical users of VPN software, you could make the case that they could be more technical in nature. So what do the attackers do? They target those individuals too. I mean, they, essentially target everybody. This is a very common scam vector. All the attackers have done in this example is added 2 hyphens to the domain name for Proton VPN. And we're able to navigate here in 2024, modern day, with a modern web browser and access this website, download the malicious package, and that would ultimately give the attackers control to our machine.
Yeah, and typically, Erkin, right, with this type of like download, right? So when people search through Google, right, or do a Google search or some other search engine to say, hey, I want to download VPN, right, for Proton, right? It's typically scammers are doing some kind of like Google ad search, right, that kind of brings their fraudulent site up to the top search, right? Is kind of what we've been seeing.
Yeah.
But you have to raise awareness around that, right? It's just sometimes they may not be getting the link, right? And no one's typing in proton-vpn.com. They're usually doing a Google search query, and then that comes up in the top results, and then they click on it, right? And then that's where they're redirected to this page, right? Same thing with the other sites as well, right? Like David Yurman, I can kind of get the search engine, right, to be optimized for that fraudulent domain.
Absolutely. Step 1 for these attackers is register the lookalike domain, create the malicious site, and then what is the vector that I'm going to use? What mechanism am I going to use to lure my victims to my malicious site? Right. And Google Ads is a very effective one, which we'll showcase in a little bit. But before we get into that, some of the next common thought processes that we receive is, okay, I get it. Sure, like these big brands, retail, whatever, I can see why they're targeted, but like clearly banking and finance is so heavily regulated, it's so protected for obvious reasons, they have to have the problem under control. And the reality is not really. Big banks are big targets because of the nature of the size of their bank, and they have such a heavy consumer base. But what ultimately ends up happening is smaller regional banks, regional credit unions are becoming even bigger targets because some of the big banks are familiar with these types of lookalike domain problems. They're familiar with external threats, external monitoring, and they also have the resources to act on that. So attackers have noticed that, okay, well, if my phishing site is going to get caught because I'm targeting this massive entity, let me start going after smaller regional banks and see what I can, what damage I can do there. And what you see here, if this slide is overwhelming, that's by design. This is what it feels like to monitor for banking and finance on the internet, the active internet. I mean, these are all fake phishing sites targeting some of the largest banks that, I'm sure you're familiar with these logos. So these attackers going through some of their thought processes, it's really interesting because it ultimately continues to be a cat and mouse game, and it always will be. If they didn't do what they do, well, we wouldn't have jobs. So I don't want to say there's a reliance or dependence on them, but it's just like if nobody conducted crime, you wouldn't need police officers. That's not the world we live in. What attackers have realized, though, is, okay, if I create these phishing sites that target real brands, that target real banks, well, these entities might start looking for these sites, and it'll, if I defraud one of their customers, the customer may report my site, and I've just spent $12 on this domain and it wasn't successful. So what if I create fake banks and fake brands, and then I still use those to defraud people? Because now, well, who are you going to report me to? I'm not impersonating a certain bank, but I'm still able to conduct fake or illegitimate business. And just to give you some of the examples that we see fake e-commerce sites. So literally just selling any good. It doesn't even have to be a designer brand or an impersonation, just selling any good online. We've seen it specifically with illicit drugs, people thinking that they can buy things through these stores and ultimately just end up losing their money.
Even dogs too, right?
Yeah, the pet scams are huge. That's actually a really good one, Michael, that I was going to forget to mention, but do your due diligence, especially online for purchasing a pet. I mean, it's crazy how much fraud is conducted with fake pet sites. Fake banks, fake universities. We'll showcase some of these. And what's really crazy about the university example is there are certain TLDs that are called generic TLDs. That's the ending of a domain name. So we're all familiar with .com, .net, .org. There's actually .education and .university that anybody can register. I can register .education, I can register .university. And so that's what attackers did. They created fake universities using these generic TLDs because from the layperson standpoint, I mean, we're domain experts. We know that anybody can register this. But if I don't work in technology and I see this university .education .university, I mean, that's pretty legitimate, right?
Yeah, especially if it's, you're used to .edu, right? .education, yep. Right? It seems legitimate.
Oh yeah, it's just a little bit longer. It's more formal. And what they did, which is really clever, is they actually create fake accrediting bodies. So now you have to know who the real accrediting bodies are to identify the real accredited universities in the United States. And they just said, okay, well, if we can create fake universities, why not create fake accrediting bodies? And this is just an example of one of those fake universities. And we have a link here for an investigation that we launched where we used one of these fake university sites to identify a ring of dozens of fake universities, how they conduct the scam, what geographical metadata that they use. For example, the one that we investigated via the link, if you're local to the Philadelphia area, they actually use the address of Radnor High School for what was Wayne State University. And what they're doing is they're using similar naming for the local area, but just mixing the names up a little bit. And then what individuals will do, they'll start to think that maybe there is a university there. Conveniently, they offer all online programs. And then that's how they get information and payment, tricking people into ultimately attending a fake university. Getting into fake banks. This is something that, just like the university example, you can see here that we have multiple tabs and all of these use the same templates. So what attackers are doing is they're cloning banking site templates, and then they're replacing the logos, the domain name. And this one is particularly funny because it actually says not a bank, credit union. So we did highlight this as the first one. I will say most of the other ones are very real and deceiving and are created with the goal to, hijack personal information. And so after going through this, the attackers will target real brands. Okay, if that gets them caught, they'll start to target, fake banks, fake universities, use that as some more possibly passive revenue that likely won't get reported. Okay, now we're stuck with the problem of, well, how are we going to get people on our phishing site? So attackers know that email-based social engineering is becoming a lot more difficult. So what they're able to do is what Michael mentioned earlier in the webinar is they've essentially become SEO or advertising experts. I mean, anyone in marketing, their goal is for somebody to type in your company name and have that result come up on Google. Well, guess what? The attackers exploit and achieve this by just paying for Google Ads. So they will legitimately create Google Ads accounts, pay to have their result come up as the top result. So when you type in Proton VPN, when you type in this designer jewelry brand, whatever it may be, if they don't have a Google ad presence, you will actually show up as the top result. And we've also seen examples where phishing sites are indexed in a search engine above the actual site. So it's tricky from the end person user because there's this inherent level of trust when we use a search engine. What I see there, the top result, that's got to be legitimate, right? No, wrong. And just to show you screenshots of this, we do have another link to this on the bottom left. We published, I guess you could say, another investigation into Google Ads and how long it's been used as a phishing vector. So here we have an example of a screenshot that somebody sent to us in 2024. And this happened when the individual was trying to set up their Amazon Echo. And they typed in like set up Alexa, something along those lines. And this was the first thing that came up on Google. So it's a sponsored result above everything else, above the real Amazon or Alexa sites, and it was a fraudulent website. And what's scary about this specific vector is it's been around since 2008. And we have, I hope this example of showing Google AdWords is not confusing, and I hope I can do justice of explaining it. There's a post by Search Engine Land in 2008 where they showed that attackers actually used Google Ads, which at the time was referred to as AdWords, to create a fake campaign targeting AdWords. So if you were a legitimate AdWords user that wanted to get to your AdWords account, you would type in AdWords on Google. What the attackers did was they created this fake lookalike domain, ad-wordsgoogle.com, and then they paid for advertising through Google to come up ahead of the real Google AdWords. So this is their own platform that they are using against Google. And the reason we highlight this, albeit it is a little bit of a confusing vector, but this has been going around since 2008. So it's frustrating to us when we hear about, AI and all these advancements in technology and why we should embrace new tech. Sure, we agree with that. All of that is fair. But the same old tech has been abused for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, as new future tech will continue to be abused. So just to recap before we get into our Q&A, the internet is a very scary place. I mean, it is very much a shit show. Fraud is a multi-billion-dollar industry that will only grow. And with each new piece of technology, there's going to be new abuse cases. And rather than close our eyes and run from it, we should embrace that technology, but we should also have the knowledge to know that this could be used against you or really abused against you. Awesome. So this is the Q&A portion of the webinar. And one of the first things we like to talk about is, well, what makes somebody a juicy target? So Michael, any thoughts that come to mind there?
Yeah, I think from, being a juicy target is definitely going to be your brand. But it may, we see a lot with, like a high value brand like Amazon, right? Some of the, major banking institutions. But what we've also been seeing and what you mentioned was, the the smaller brands are being targeted, right? Because they may not have a monitoring solution in place. Um, and it's something, and then also, it's something that, you know, we're trying to raise more awareness of, right? For the smaller brands to say, hey, bigger brands can afford some of these solutions and they have something in place. But your brand could also be targeted, right? And can be used and abused for fraud. Um, from an individual perspective, right? I mean, I think you have here is like weak passwords, right? Yeah, weak passwords are always going to be a juicy target, right? There's a number of lists, right, that are out there that people could try to get into your social media account as well, and then also take over and then continue to impersonate you even without your knowledge, right? If you haven't used like one of those social media platforms or that account in such a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like I said, it all comes down to, you know, that's the smaller brand where your site could be cloned and used as a phishing kit, right? So, the fact and what we've seen and how it's being so rampant now is kind of what I feel as though like is more of a juicy target, right? So it's not just the big brands, it's also your smaller brands, in my opinion.
Yeah. And one of the things we talked about on webinar number 1 is this concept of like this fraud stink. And I know it's kind of a funny term, but what it refers to is, if you don't take your trash out, it's only going to start to smell worse. So if you don't take advantage of this fraud problem targeting your organization, it only gets worse. So if there are lookalike domains that are targeting your brand, and then attackers take it a step further and they create phishing sites or impersonate your brand on those lookalike domains, and they see that, okay, nobody's reporting me, my sites are staying up, that creates more of a fraud stink, and that makes you a juicier target for these attackers because they've already proven they can get away with these attacks. And what we've seen for financial institutions, attackers will actually create phishing kits using their main website. So now all of a sudden, because nobody's taken action on this fraud problem, attackers decide, okay, well, this is a great website to use as a template for all my fake banking sites. So absolutely have to get ahead of the problem. And then getting into what you can do to protect yourself as an individual. Michael, what are some of the first things that come to mind?
Yeah, so interesting things, right? And I don't know if I recommend it to everyone, but if you want to prevent some kind of impersonation, right, you probably want to grab some social media, right, accounts and kind of, harden the password, lock it down with 2FA if you're not going to use it. Not everyone does it. Sometimes I won't do it with certain social media, but there's some that I do, and I collected them and just don't use them. But the other thing, to protect yourself from like a password manager perspective, and we kind of really haven't talked too much about, importance of passwords in this webinar, but you definitely want to, use a personal password manager. The other thing that I think that you can do as well is also do searches on yourself, right? So if you use Google or DuckDuckGo, do a search on your name, right? See what comes up, see what pops up. As well. And then there is also something that you could also do as an individual. There's like data broker removal services that you can do, which I think we talk about in other webinars. But you could sign up for some of these, personal data broker removal services to kind of remove your digital footprint, right? And I think that's important. That's an action that I think individuals can take, right, to kind of limit what what is out there on yourself. But you kind of want to be proactive, right? And do those searches, see what's out there, see if someone's impersonating you, from time to time, right, as an individual. Um, that's kind of what I would recommend, right, to protect yourself.
Yeah. I think that those are all great cases. You can take the Googling yourself a bit further and create a Google alert around your name. It's much easier if you have a unique name like myself. It'll alert you when you come up. It may not be as easy if you have a more commonly used name. Also, not trusting search engine results. I know that does sound negative and pessimistic to say. And really, a better way to describe it would be scrutinize those results, because you can't guarantee with certainty that the top thing on an ad result or the top thing that's indexed in a search engine is in fact legitimate based on the historical scam data that we have.
Yeah. Not just to go back to that, not every Google search query for like Amazon call, customer support. A lot, a personal family member said, "Hey, I need to, cancel my Amazon account. How do I do it?" She, searched it on Google, and then this phone number came up for Amazon customer support, and she was scammed, right? I mean, that's how easy, how quick it can happen, right? As far as if you're going through those top results.
Did we mention the family safe word?
No, we haven't. And I think I
It's a
know
good
when we
one.
talk about generative AI, right, and there's AI in that webinar, we'll get more into that. But family safe words, code words, right? Yeah, is also a good one.
Awesome. And then lastly, how can you tell if the website you're on is legitimate or the website you plan to visit is legitimate?
Yeah, and that's tough, right? It's
Very
really,
tough.
really, really challenging, and we face this as professionals, right? How challenging it could be. But there are some things like, who is domain, aging, right? So you can kind of go to MX Toolbox, right? And type in, that domain and figure out, okay, well, how old is this domain? Was it recently purchased, right? Like 2 months ago, and then it's for a well-known brand, right? That has been around for 15 years, 20 years. And then some of these other ones, right, like Broken Links, right, Erkin, that I think you'll probably explain a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, that was as we start investigating these fake websites, fake universities, what we identified is that attackers will keep the social media icons, but they will not create new social media accounts. And if they're smart, they would link back to the real impersonating social media account. But what they do is they just break the links. So you have all of these social media icons that essentially have broken links. And here we are giving them ammo. So now they're either going to create social media accounts or they'll just make them link to the entity they're impersonating. But that is definitely one giveaway we've seen from our standpoint as analysts.
And threat intel sites, what kind of sites could people use, Erkin, from that perspective to help out?
Yeah, I think some of the more common ones are VirusTotal. I'm personally a fan of URL Scan because it allows you to throw that website in. It'll immediately conduct a scan and give you a visual representation of what is on that site. And certainly it is a cat and mouse game. Attackers may get more creative and do things like geofencing, where they'll only allow the website to be visited from a certain region. But I think those are great places to start. Awesome. So, thank you again for taking the time to sit through this webinar series. And the next few webinars are all solution based. So, promise to give you more actionable steps that you can take, once again, as an individual, but also if you work in corporate cybersecurity, what are things that you can start doing at no cost to help you get a better handle on this fraud problem. So thank you.